In Chapter 4 of Portrait, we observed Stephen becoming a very pious young man, being asked to consider if he might be cut out for the priesthood, deciding instead to become an apostate, and finally, having an ecstatic vision of a half-naked girl standing in shallow water at the shore. This latter vision Stephen tries to narrate in his newfound role as artist, leaving behind all thoughts of the church. But, of course, church language and church imagery are so much a part of him at this point that the erotic and aesthetic image of the girl is soon cloaked in language reminding him of the Blessed Virgin Mary, who Stephen had been counseled to think of any time he had lusty thoughts. Now we find Stephen as a university student, sleeping through lectures and taking advantage of the women in his life who take care of him. I would like to take a close look at the passage where Stephen has a conversation about aesthetic theory with the Dean of Studies. It begins on page 185 in my book. Let's set the stage a little bit. Stephen is too late to attend the lecture that is currently ongoing, so he heads to the physics theater to wait for that class to begin. When he opens the door, he sees the Dean of Studies kneeling before the grate, laying a fire to warm the room for the students soon to arrive. Stephen and the Dean have a conversation about aesthetics in which they are often at cross purposes. Stephen is a little bit tetchy throughout the conversation. The Dean has chosen a topic of conversation he thinks Stephen will enjoy. He is trying to set Stephen at ease and is generally kindly, if perhaps not always quick enough on the uptake to understand Stephen's jokes. Things are going along okay, no major rifts, when the Dean uses the word funnel to describe a device one can use to pour oil into a lamp. Stephen does not know this word. Where he is from, and remember his family is completely impoverished by now, they say tundish. Stephen tries to laugh off this small hiccup in the conversation, but the Dean, aware from his manner that Stephen is offended, tries to pour oil on the water by saying, tundish, that is a most interesting word. I must look that word up. Upon my word, I must. For Stephen, the Dean's courtesy of manner rang a little false, maybe because brooding Stephen is just primed to take offense wherever he can. Then we get a little bit of jealous rumination based on the story of the prodigal son in the Bible, but conflated with Stephen's resentment of the English. It turns out the Dean of Studies is a convert to Catholicism, part of the 19th century Oxford movement. Stephen's insecurity and narcissism converge in a very interesting passage. Stephen thinks the language in which we are speaking is his before it is mine. How different are the words home, Christ, ale, master, on his lips and on mine. I cannot speak or write these words without unrest of spirit. His language, so familiar and so foreign, will always be for me an acquired speech. I have not made or accepted its words. My voice holds them at bay. My soul frets in the shadow of his language. Let's look carefully at this passage, performing a close reading to figure out how it works. I suppose the first thing that pops out are the 4 italicized words. These words seem to have no connection to one another. Are they just random words? It is true that these particular words would highlight the difference between a Dubliner like Stephen and a well-educated Englishman like the Dean of Studies, just on the basis of pronunciation. But I suspect there is more to it than that. Home has a particular meaning in British colonial discourse. It always means England, even if you were born in India or Ireland or one of the other British imperial possessions. Christ, of course, in Ireland, would probably bring up the religious split between Catholics and Protestants that for so long dominated Irish politics. Ale might bring up the stereotypes of the Irish as drunkards, and master would be a particularly sensitive word to a colonial subject. But what to make of the first line of the passage? How can English belong to the Dean of Studies before it belongs to Stephen? What Stephen is discussing here is the British imposition of English as the only language that they allowed to be spoken in Ireland. Now, this happened long before Stephen was born. His parents and even his grandparents are native speakers of English and don't speak Irish at all. But Stephen is acknowledging here that the English have a different relation to the English language than the Irish do. For the English, it is not a language of domination, though if you go back far enough, the Angles who brought their language came to England as conquerors. But for the Irish, it is both a mother tongue, so familiar and so foreign, and the language of conquest and domination. Of course, later in this chapter, we will see Stephen refusing to attend lessons to learn Irish. He doesn't think Irish is his language either. But in the passage we're looking at now, we see a gap that stands between the language that should have been Stephen's mother tongue and the language that actually is. He expresses his feelings towards English as unrest of spirit when he speaks or writes its words. I find his assertion that he has not made or accepted its words a little odd. I mean, I am also a native speaker of English, and I also have the wrong accent if you consider that the only right accent is that of an upper-class, Oxbridge-educated Englishman. But I don't for a minute think I had the option to make or accept the words of English, and I don't think anyone else does that either. Sure, sometimes we have a new invention, and someone has to come up with a name for it. But if we all went around making up our own words for everything, we literally couldn't communicate with other English speakers. That's just not how language works. I don't know who invented the word table, but I know that other people around me used the word to describe a flat piece of furniture with legs, designed for putting things like plates on, and that I passed that word down to my child in turn. So Stephen's belief that the language will belong to him only if he makes or accepts its words is very, very odd. He is asking for a relationship with language that no one else has. The idea that his voice holds English words at bay, or that his soul frets in the shadow of the Dean's language, asserts a novel way of considering how language works, reminding readers that language doesn't work the same way for all of us. Imposed languages sit differently with us from languages that develop organically where we live. The icing on this particular cake is in Stephen's diary entry for 13 April. He writes, "That tundish has been on my mind for a long time. I looked it up and find it English, and good old blunt English, too. Damn the Dean of Studies and his funnel. What did he come here for, to teach us his own language or to learn it from us? Damn him one way or the other." Tundish, in other words, came to Ireland a long time ago, and whereas English people later adopted a newer word, funnel, which comes into English from French, Irish people kept using the older word, which had applications in brewing, among other fields. What do you think? Does Stephen change his mind about English here? He is still calling it the Dean's own language, but his discovery about the meaning of tundish seems to imply that he now sees his own relationship to English in a somewhat different way. Irish English has preserved elements of the language that have died out in Britain, just as Irish English preserves some elements of the Irish language in phrasing and vocabulary. Joyce may have had similar thoughts about English in his youth. We know that in Ulysses and especially in Finnegan's Wake, he remade English as well as the English novel. Perhaps feeling like an outsider to his mother tongue enabled experimentation that wouldn't have been possible if he had felt like an insider. Or perhaps these thoughts belong to Stephen alone. He is a young man who thinks that in order to write, he has to leave behind everything familiar to him. He tells his best friend, Cranley, that "I will tell you what I will do and what I will not do. I will not serve that in which I no longer believe, whether it call itself my home, my fatherland, or my church, and I will try to express myself in some mode of life or art as freely as I can and as wholly as I can, using for my defense the only arms I allow myself to use, silence, exile, and cunning." This is page 247 in my book, immediately before the diary entries begin. He utterly rejects anyone and anything that might have a call on him, choosing isolation as necessary to creative art. Now, Stephen is, as we know so well by now, often deluded about himself, and is also a big one for grand statements. No half measures for him. At the very end of the novel, when his mother wisely wishes that he will learn what the heart is and how it feels, instead of understanding what his mother does, that there's no writing without understanding human connection, Stephen grandly says, "I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience, and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race." Nice gesture, but Stephen should have listened to his mother. Instead, his next statement, and the closing words of the novel, is, "Old father, old artificer, stand me now and ever in good stead." These do not sound like the words of someone who has figured out the mistake he made on the first page of the novel, when as a 2-year-old he assumed that caring for others meant weakness. No, Stephen is doubling down on becoming his father, having masculine authority, masculine artifice, and masculine blindness to the reality of experience.